Hey, Sue.
Hey, Ginny, how are you?
Good. Hi, Ron.
Hi, Jenny. Welcome. San Francisco, huh?
San Francisco. Yeah, this is an old one. I haven't been there for a while.
Ginny, have you had an opportunity to go to any of the finance committee meetings on
No.
this issue? No.
No, I used to go to them for my budget a lot if I was adding things and stuff, but I haven't had to do that for a while. So
Yeah.
okay with me.
Right? I know.
Just wait.
Oh, Sarah, shh, you weren't supposed to hear that.
Right, here she is, lurking in the corners.
Right, I thought it was a 6:30 meeting, so I've been on for a while.
Oh, dear.
I think Thursday's 6:30, but whatever.
You expecting a big turnout?
I did a lot of outreach. I reached out to all the boards and committees and asked all the chairs to send along the flyer, and I reached out to the landowners up there, MECT and trustees of reservation, and I tried to do my best to get everyone's attention on it. So we'll see.
I sent it to my board members.
Yes, thank you.
And I'm sure you sent it to Paul, right? Did you, or did you
I
not?
don't think I sent it to Paul.
Oh, I figured you would have, so I didn't bother, but I did send it to Liz and Kara too, and Liz said she was gonna go on. I'm not sure if Kara will or not.
There's been a lot of resident input next door neighbor.
Yeah.
So I expect people to be on. They're aware of it.
Okay, I gotta put my dinner in. I'm putting myself on mute.
Hi, everyone.
Hello, Gary. Welcome.
Thank you. Hey, Chris.
Hello.
Thanks for your work. Good job last night.
Thank you.
Hi, Sue.
Hey. Hi, Chris.
Hello.
Okay, number 2 of your 4 for the week.
Yep.
All
Not
right.
anymore.
Got our weeks are aligned just alike, 4 out of 4.
Wow.
Musical theater classics with the LA Philharmonic. Join me in concert at the
Just give everyone a couple more minutes. Okay, I'd like to get started. I'd like to welcome participants to the virtual Planning Board Public Forum on the LCD of January 12th. I'd like to call the Planning Board to order. Mr. Coons.
Present there, Ron. Sorry.
Okay. Mr. Licio, I believe, is not here. Ms. Foley. Mr. Gilbert.
Present.
Mr. Olney.
I'm here.
Mr. Russell.
I'm here.
Okay, and we have a quorum tonight. Before we get started, I'd like to remind participants to use the raise hand feature. If you have a question, please wait to be recognized. I will do my best to try to have you called on in the order you were raised your hand. This meeting is being recorded. Before we welcome Chris Kushel from MAPC, I'd like to turn the Planning Board's 40R Working Group representative, Gary Russell, for some opening remarks. Gary?
Thanks, Ron. So first of all, thanks again to everyone for being here tonight virtually. Looks like we have a decent crowd online. For some of you, there may be some repeat information, but I hope that everyone learned something tonight. So what we're talking about tonight is what we know as the 40R Smart Growth Overlay District Study, which is a mouthful. But what we're talking about is looking at options through the 40R process for development in the limited commercial district. So I'm going to run through a few facts about what that is, and then we'll talk briefly about what this means for our process. So the limited commercial district is essentially everything north of Route 128. It's about 760 acres, and it runs, you're all familiar with the MAC in that area and the transfer station. So it's all of that. Within that area of 760 acres, a lot of that is already protected thanks to decades of hard work by a lot of local citizens, MECT, trustees of the reservation, individuals who started that movement a long time ago. So that's about 442 acres that's already permanently protected. And then of course, wherever there is jurisdiction for Conservation Commission for wetlands, that also is protected simply by the fact that we have those environmental laws in place. So there is a lot of land that's already protected. And that's not to downplay any issues that we are going to be discussing about development. So that's with 760 total, 60% protected. So what's remaining? The remaining land of that, there's about 40 acres that's already developed for local business. As I mentioned, the athletic club, the medical office building, the farm stand, there's the warehouse areas. There's also some town-owned land, and that's approximately 40 acres total. That includes the compost site that's on the east side near the Manchester Athletic Club, and then of course the transfer station down Pine Street. Then there's also other landowners. So there's a remaining developed land is owned by Gordon College. They own about 147 acres, and that is in the western part of the LCD. We know the Brown Family Trust owns 23 acres, which is the subject of the 40B, which is different.
Through this tonight.
And I'll talk about that a little more in just a moment. And then of course we talked about the Manchester Athletic Club, and they own 40 acres of land that abuts the club. So directly next to the land that they already have developed. So when we look at what revenue comes out of this area, the annual property tax revenue for the developed land with those businesses is about $140,000. And then there's an additional about $45,000 in tax revenue from the undeveloped land. So we're looking at, $185,000 a year in tax revenue for that area above 128. So how we got to this place for this forum, this study is a long trip back in time. It goes all the way back to our master plan, which we started several years ago. We went through about 3 years of very intensive public engagement. I personally attended over 100 meetings. So you can't accuse us of not doing due diligence with public process going through the master plan. And out of that process, two really high priorities were identified. And the first was to increase town revenue to support our infrastructure and maintenance. And we've all seen the water main breaks, crumbling sidewalks, the list goes on. We are pretty far behind in terms of where we're at with our maintenance and infrastructure. So we're trying to play catch up as many towns and cities do. At the same time, we have our own version of the housing crisis that we see all across the state and the region. There's a housing need, and in particular in Manchester, we're looking at a need to diversify our housing choice. So that's not only talking about the affordable subsidized units, but also a great need to provide a variety of choices, and especially downsized, smaller housing. And that can serve both our aging population as well as our young folks who are starting out and may want to move back to town. So we have people aging in place who can't afford to stay in their large homes. And then we have young adults wanting to move back to town who can't afford to buy a large home. So, so there we are. We're looking to diversify the choices that people have to remain in the community. So this is always about choices, and that's what the master plan was about, was identifying the issues and the priorities, and then we have to make choices. You know, what's most important? How are we going to deal with that? And so zoning is really the legal toolkit that we have to control a lot of this, or guide the change, guide development. And that's important to note that the processes we're talking about are choices that we as a community decide and not react to, which is what's happening with the 40B. That's a totally separate topic, but it's related in the way that a lot of people are getting confused that we want the 40B or the town promoted it in some way. I don't think 40B, especially as has been presented, is anybody's choice, but we're being forced to react to it. So what we want to talk to everyone about tonight and get feedback on is, what are the choices we can make? What can we as a community decide and create? So within zoning, there are a few tools that are available to look at the limited commercial district. One of those is simply you maintain exactly as it is. And that means that the uses that are there could expand, or similar uses could come in. But as we've seen over the decades, the restrictions to development currently in place don't allow for much to happen, and therefore there's not a lot of interest on the part of developers. I mean, hence the name limited commercial district. So the other option is we can change our zoning. So we could look at the LCD district zoning that's in place and have a process where we totally rewrite that on our own. There are challenges to that because, well, as anyone who's participated in any of these processes knows, it takes time. And when you create zoning as a permanent change, there's not a lot of flexibility. The other idea that we could do is create our own overlay district, which is similar to creating our own zoning, but it's limited to one area. And then finally, the other choice that we're talking about tonight is through the state's 40R program, which assists communities to create a mixed use overlay district that will help us meet our housing needs, but also allow for commercial development. And so that's what we're looking for tonight. We're going to be talking about the issues. And it's important to note that all of these are public process, and nothing's off the table, especially at this point, since the 40B came up. The timing is a little unfortunate because it appears that to some that we're trying to do this all at once, but in fact, we've been looking at the 40R and the limited commercial district for a long time. And the folks that have been involved in that recognize that the area that's already developed should be the place that we look to encourage development rather than looking at pristine land. So that's part of that. And then finally, all of this, regardless of where we land, if we land on the 40R or we land on some other zoning tool, it all goes through more public engagement, meaning from you folks giving us comments, concerns, issues, more study, which may involve more consultant studies for specific technical advice. And most importantly, it requires a 2/3 town meeting vote. So What we're talking about tonight is all about how we as a community can make these decisions and decide what it is that we want. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris. Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Let's see. So I don't have too long of a presentation in terms of the number of slides, but there's a fair amount of content. So what we thought we would do is at a few points during this presentation, I'll pause and we can take some questions about what you've just heard before kind of moving on. And we'll probably limit the amount of time that we have for those kind of breaks. And then if we don't get to you, we have plenty of time at the end, but I just want to be respectful of everybody's time there. So this first slide actually really just summarizes everything that the introduction that Mr. Russell just gave, kind of leading up to the point of the town engaging with MAPC. So for those who are not familiar with us, we're the Metropolitan Area Planning Council. We are the regional planning agency for the 101 cities and towns of the Metro Boston area. So it's essentially sort of within the 495 belt, and then we go as far north. I think Rockport is probably our most northern community. And we wear a whole number of hats. We provide a whole kind of range of services to our communities. In this case, for this project, we are acting in a capacity as a consultant to the town in what I sort of consider is our bread and butter type of planning work. That's land use planning and zoning. So I personally have done a fair amount of work up in the North Shore, which I love doing. I'm currently also working in Rockport as well as Salem, and I've done projects in Beverly, Hamilton, and other places as well. And you know, one of the things I love about the North Shore, in particular within our region, is every community is different, but all the communities, you all have such a great sort of that New England charm, that sense of place, and that really strong history. At the same time, though, what I would say is, you know, all of the communities, we don't live in sort of a time capsule where we can sort of freeze things. Communities are constantly kind of evolving and growing and changing. And so I guess I just would say I commend the town for sort of being proactive and undergoing this type of planning work to actually plan for the future so that you're not always reacting to things such as the 40B development that's been proposed. So I'll talk just briefly now about the process for this specific project that we're doing. It started off with mainly the main first task was essentially establishing a vision for this area. So it sort of builds upon what the recommendations of the master plan were, which were maybe at the 30,000 foot level. And now the visioning brings it down a little bit closer to the ground. And so that process was done through a number of meetings with stakeholders, landowners, various boards, as well as an online survey to the community that was quite well participated in. And even though we've sort of completed that task, it's never really fully completed. So it's constantly, all of this is very much an iterative process. So as we continue to get feedback from various people, that still continues to inform both the vision and what the ultimate deliverable would be. Right now, we're kind of focused on the tasks 3, 4, and 5, or actually mainly 3 and 4, which is the site analysis. And within that, there's a number of tasks that are required for this kind of special type of zoning, this 40R zoning, that it needs to be approved by the state in order for the state to provide financial incentives to the town. And we're also working on the actual concept of the 40R. What are the zoning recommendations? What are the design standards? And all of these subtasks, they are occurring concurrently. And that happens because these different tasks actually inform each other. So for example, although there are certain requirements to create a 40R, there's also a lot of flexibility. And so depending on what the actual sort of specifics of the zoning are, that actually ends up affecting the parts of the subtasks of the site analysis, such as the calculations. So I mentioned the survey. I will kind of continue to sort of note various parts of the survey that were relevant for different parts that inform the zoning. As I mentioned, it had a good response rate, about 200 and almost 230 respondents. This slide right here, which I think might look a little bit blurry on your screen, this was one of our questions that was asking high level, what sort of place would you like this area that's under study to become in the future? And I thought it was kind of interesting that the top two choices actually kind of go hand in hand. The top kind of highest percentage response was that people envisioned this as sort of a quieter residential neighborhood that had also included a number of commercial services and recreation opportunities. And the second choice was that this was a place where people can essentially age in place as people are maybe looking to downsize their single family homes, or maybe they don't feel like, because either they're empty nesters or they don't want to take care of a big yard, or whatever the reason would be, this could be an opportunity for those folks, as well as for people who maybe are younger, maybe either just starting out with a family and maybe can't at this point afford to purchase a single family home, or just don't want to at this point. And so I think those two choices, when you put them together, kind of helps sort of point to the type of character that a majority of people are looking forward. This is not going to be an assembly row of Somerville, for example. This map that you now see on the screen, this is the proposed 40R district boundaries. So it is a very small portion of the entire LCD that was described in the introduction. You can see it extends on the west side of School Street, which would include where the proposed 40B project is. It includes the area where the MAC is, and that developer, that landowner does have some interest in potentially redeveloping at some point his property. And so this is now showing part of our task, which is the parcel analysis that we need to do, not only to help kind of inform what the potential zoning would be, but also as part of the requirements that the state requires. So I'll just kind of hit a couple of the highlights. So the entire proposed district, it's 15 parcels, although much fewer actual landowners, because many of those parcels are contiguous and owned under common ownership. The entire proposed district would be 112.5 acres. So that's kind of the starting point. That's how big the actual district is. For the 40R though, we have to kind of also look at some other aspects of the land. So what the state, the Department of Housing and Community Development, DHCD, they require first for the town to look at what they consider environmentally constrained land. So that's land where there are wetlands or steep slopes, as they define it. And so that land is a large portion of this proposed district. It's almost 82 acres. It's all of the red that you see on that bottom map there. This doesn't actually mean, just to clarify, that a landowner could not develop on that land. It's just part of the calculations that we have to perform, and I'll explain why that's important as we move along. So we take that land, and then we take the actual built environment that's already there, subtract those two things out, and that gives us a figure of what is called gross developable land, and that's 25 acres. So that 25 acres is actually going to be important as we kind of move forward in terms of what the requirements of the zoning are. So I'm happy to pause here for a couple of minutes, and if there are questions, I'm happy to try and answer them, or someone else can answer as well.
Don't see any questions, Chris.
Okay. If there's no questions, I'll keep moving on. And then we, of course, are going to have time at the end for any questions as well. So I'm going to transition now a little bit to talking about the actual zoning. So I'm going to break this into two parts. First, talking about what are the actual requirements of zoning, and that's where sort of if the town decides to undergo take on a 40R, there are requirements from the state. So where there's, I guess, not as much flexibility. So I'll go through that first. The first is that on balance, there needs to be more residential development than commercial development. And that means like a 51 to 49% sort of split. This 40R, I think what's great about it is it allows communities to sort of achieve their goals as it relates to commercial development by allowing commercial development and mixed use development. But I think we do need to acknowledge that ultimately the intent of 40R is to help diversify and increase the housing stock. That's one aspect. It also means, by the way, that if the town is interested in having more commercial under the 40R, then it's kind of in the interest of the town to allow more residentials to bump up that the allowable amount of commercial. Residential development must have at least 20% of its units be affordable on the subsidized housing index. Residential also has to be allowed by right. Commercial can be, or non-residential uses can be also allowed by right, but that the town has discretion on that. And then there are minimum density requirements as part of what the state considers this is a smart growth overlay district. And one of the hallmarks of smart growth is that development is clustered together to make it more walkable. So for multifamily, that's 20 units per acre. And for single families, and in the case here, what we're considering now is our townhomes and cottages is 8 units per acre. And just to also, I think it's important to clarify that units per acre density requirement is not based on the entire district. It's only based on that subset of the gross developable land that I explained. That's 25 acres. So it's obviously quite a difference looking at 25 acres versus 112 acres. Another nice thing, and that we've been developing some concepts for it allows for design standards, which are sort of obligatory elements to help ensure that the future design is sort of meeting the needs of the town. So within, for Manchester, in addition, kind of some of the things that we've been starting to think about, I have here and I'll run through. The other one thing I would mention is I presented this last night to the planning board. So I received a lot of feedback. So I haven't incorporated that feedback into these slides yet. I think what I'm going to do is wait to hear what the feedback from everyone is, including the public tonight, and then sort of make revisions. So I'll note those changes as I go through them. So for uses, one of the things that really kind of came loud and clearly was that people, the public, the community doesn't want this area to compete with the existing downtown. We don't want to sort of recreate all of those uses that are in the downtown. Instead, this should be sort of a complementary type of neighborhood. And so some of the uses that I've listed here, this is not exhaustive, but includes things like things that one of the landowners has expressed a potential interest in, such as a hotel, recreational club, wellness studios, pet grooming things, breweries, things that I think would kind of all be compatible together. While we don't want this area to compete with the downtown, and we don't want it to be filled probably with restaurants and other eateries, I think my recommendation is to allow, at least through a special permit, that use when it's sort of an accessory use to something like a hotel, for example. For the multifamily, one of the things that DHCD does allow is for us to actually take the, to kind of cap the amount of residential. So it's not unfettered. So you don't take, you know, your entire district and sort of be kind of inundated with multifamily. So we have the ability to cap it, and that's what I'm sort of put in here as a proposal. And that number, really 255 multifamily units, that would be the lowest that we could actually go as for this as part, and have kind of a justification as part of the 40R. And that's basically by taking the 25 acres, multiplying it by the 20 units per acre. But then since we're assuming that there's going to be commercial, we can assume up to 49% of the area would be commercial. And when you kind of do that math, you get to 255 units. For the single families, we can kind of use a similar logic and also cap that. Again, we can go higher, certainly, or even something for single family, the townhomes and cottages. We don't have to cap it. So everything's, this is just a sort of first pass for feedback. Other aspects of the zoning include dimensional standards. So, you know, the dimensional standards, I think, will work hand in hand with the design standards, which I'll move into next. So the height would be looking at essentially 3 stories. One of the things that people have expressed a strong interest in is preservation of land. And so here's a proposal, which again, some of the feedback that I received was we might want to bump some of this up a little bit. Of 20% of the total project area would be required to be protected open space, and maybe allow for paths and trails, but otherwise remain undeveloped. And then within actual sort of clusters of development that would occur, again, right now, there's a proposal for 20% of that being usable open space. And by usable, that means things like plazas, playgrounds, things of that nature. And again, all of these percentages can certainly be adjusted. The other thing that I'd mention, as was mentioned in the introduction, is that, you know, in many ways, Manchester, there are single family homes throughout the town, and many of them are quite large. And so this is an opportunity to diversify the type of housing. And so one type might be multifamily, another type, and that's received a lot of interest through the survey, were cottages, so small kind of clustered homes, as well as sort of suburban style townhomes. And for that, we could put a proposal for how big those units could actually be. For parking, I think this will probably change a bit, and even some of the feedback that I got last night was, you know, here we've kind of thought about what is the minimum parking, which is often important, but something else that's important is maximum parking, because you don't want to overpark your place, because that inhibits the creation of a walkable environment. Generally speaking, I'd say 1.5 spaces per unit for a residential development of this type of neighborhood is appropriate. And so, you know, we can put in a maximum as well. For commercial uses, generally just kind of 4 spaces per 1,000 square feet is, again, generally considered a best practice. And there could be opportunities to allow for reductions through a special permit by the planning board if the applicant can sort of essentially prove that less parking is needed. Okay, so I'm going to transition to the design standards in a moment. I will pause again if there are any questions about what I've talked about so far.
Yes, Ann Harrison had a question first, Chris.
Hi, you said more residential than commercial. Does that mean in terms of square feet or in terms of value, or what does it mean or property value? What does it mean?
For the purposes of this bylaw, it refers to square footage. So if you had, sorry, go ahead.
go ahead. So cottages take up a lot more square feet, and therefore cottages give you more commercial than multifamily.
Well, maybe a little bit. It doesn't include, for example, the yard and the driveway. It's actually the actual built area. So if you assumed a cottage is 1,400 square feet, a multifamily is probably going to be around 1,200 square feet gross. So it wouldn't be a huge difference. The other benefit, though, I would add to a multifamily is it clusters. Because it's a denser typology, it actually allows for more space. It leaves room essentially for commercial development.
Okay, if you have, say, a 3-story multifamily and a 1-story cottage, each of which has the same footprint, then they are equivalent in terms of what they allow for commercial.
I mean, if you had a 3-story multifamily building, that's probably going to be, it's not just the
Okay,
footprint.
so say for the 3-story multifamily, it has the equivalent, it's the equivalent of 5 cottages.
Well, I mean, it might be. I mean, it's however the math works and how big it is. I mean, I would think a 3-story multifamily would probably be larger than 5 cottages.
Even 6.
Chris,
Sure. I think maybe I'm missing the point.
I think the confusion is the square footage is not of the building footprint, but of the buildable, the entirety of the living area.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sue.
We have another question from Sandy next. Have a last name.
Yes, thank you. I guess I want to take a step back and thank you for going through the different options, Gary, at the beginning. And have we engaged this consultancy to review the 4 different options and what that means regarding what we can build potentially, what are the stipulations under the 40R? Are there any tipping points regarding the amount of units, and financially, what does that mean for the town? It's, it's hard listening in. I listened in yesterday, and it seemed to me that there were some, what we have control of in the town and what the regulations are regarding 40R. And it would be really good to understand the difference between what are the regulations and standards, what are we sort of scoping right now, what would be our options if we went with some of these other zoning choices. Are you looking at that whole sort of spectrum of potential building types within the different zoning options that we have?
Well, MAPC was.
Do you want me to? Yeah, go ahead.
Sure, go ahead, Sue.
I was just going to say, the short answer is that MAPC is looking, has only been charged with looking at the 40R district options. So it would be other, the town would look at other options in separate studies, or could look at them alongside it once we have this one done. You can essentially create similar regulations. The difference, some of the differences are in the requirements and the incentives. So the pros and cons that come with the 40R. So
right,
answer, MAPC is only looking at the 40R. That's all they've been charged with.
Right. And I guess what would be very helpful is to understand what the town loses control of in appeasing 40R versus what its gain is. And that may not be the time right now regarding what's being presented, but I feel like it's being presented in a vacuum without having those comparison points. And I think that will be crucial to move this going forward at any point beyond this discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. One thing I would maybe just mention to your question about what does the town sort of, quote unquote, lose or give up in terms of its power. It doesn't lose anything. There are, my slide that was a few slides earlier, sort of note what the requirements are for the town to engage in a 40R, but it's still a local bylaw. What the town gains, in addition to, I think, helping to achieve some of the town's goals, but in specifics, one of the benefits to a 40R is there are financial incentives to the town. And so in this case, it sort of depends upon how many units could be built, essentially. So right now, in terms of the way the numbers would sort of be working under this current sort of zoning framework, it would be a payment of about $350,000 upon adopting the zoning. And then if any housing is actually permitted within the district, it's $3,000 per unit. And so, that could add up to being another over about $1 million. So my experience from working on 40 hours, that's usually not the primary motivation for communities. It's sort of like a sweetener at the end.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Ms. Hill is next with a question.
Yes, thank you, Ron. Chris, hello. I had my hand up with your first break, and so I think Ron didn't see it. So I want to just take you back for 1 minute to the survey piece. What were the demographics of the survey? The 225 people that took the survey.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know off the top of my head. My colleague was the one that had administered this survey, and she unfortunately had to go on a medical leave quite quickly. So some of that information, it just didn't occur to me to try and find that out. So I could find that out for you if we actually captured that, which I don't recall if we did.
So just in terms of the validity or reliability of the survey instrument itself, it's a relatively small percentage of the population of Manchester. And I don't know how much we can rely on it to depict the demographic profile of Manchester. Would you agree?
I think in any planning process, towns do the best they can to get as many people who are interested in responding to this. I think a number of people might have seen it and weren't interested in that. Maybe that's why they didn't respond. I'm not sure. 228, of course, is a small percentage of your total town population. On the other hand, the way planning has been typically done, it's generally just in some night meetings where you might get 20 people to show up. And so you're getting a good 10 times as many. So I think that this is a pretty good amount of people to respond to this. And the other thing, again, I recognize your point, but one of the things that we'll see as I go through some of the other questions is there was really a remarkable amount of consistency in terms of what the responses were.
Yeah, but not a lot of consensus. I think, the consistency was around the value of open spaces and quiet areas around buildings, etc. So I just wanted to be clear about who took the survey and what that tells us about the overall interest of the town. Okay, my second question related to the very slide you used, so I'm glad you used it, which was the review of existing parcels. And then I do want to just talk right to the point you just made about the potential payments to the town. But if we take 25 acres as the buildable land, gross developable land, and just to roughly calculate, half of that would be residential, half of it would be ideally commercial. So we're talking about 12 acres. So let's just look at the 12 acres of commercial development for a minute. We have to assume that part of that acreage would be taken up with roads, parking, streetscapes, etc. So let's just bring that down to 10 acres maybe. In terms of your experience, you mentioned these other projects you did in other towns. Were they 40R projects in Rockport, Beverly Hills?
No, I've worked on another 40R, but not in Rockport.
Okay.
That's a separate project.
So 10 commercial acres would typically generate how much revenue?
So so I think it's an important distinction before we would even talk about numbers is that 25 acres is very much for the purposes of the calculations for DHCD for their payments. The actual potential land that could be developed is actually higher, because if you look at on the map on this slide, this red area, all that red area is considered environmentally constrained, primarily because this is a hilly area. DHCD kind of asks us to sort of subtract that out, which actually goes to the benefit of the town. It allows us to sort of limit the amount of residential development, but there's actually nothing that's preventing commercial development that can occur. And in fact, even some of the areas that are red actually have development on them. So we can't really use 10 acres or 12 acres or even starting at 25 acres as what the basis would be for what actual development could occur.
Yes, you say it assumes 50% could be developed. But I'm curious, where are those assumptions based? I mean, could you give me some examples of why you think that the wetlands and the, that largely environmentally restricted area is actually developable?
Well, the
Particularly in
wetland,
Manchester, because we have a lot of concerns about the environment here.
yeah. So the wetlands would not be developable. The areas that are just hills that are not wetlands could be developable, as I said, as evidenced by the fact that parts of it have already been developed. Not everything, but parts of it could be.
But we don't know what percentage. Okay, lastly on this topic, and then later on, I have one more topic, but the incentive payment to the town. So this is structured to encourage the most density possible within what is going to be 12 or 20 acres. Is that correct?
No, this is actually what we are proposing is actually minimizing the amount of what the density could potentially be if we did not cap it. We're capping it at what really could be the minimum amount that we can sort of get away with, essentially, for lack of a better word.
Well, then why do we have these incentives? I mean, are towns not incented to develop to the maximum so they can get the $1.5 million?
Correct. I mean, if the town, we could raise this cap, or we could get rid of this cap if the town wanted to receive a higher payment than what it is. For example, the 40R that I worked on in Woburn, the developer wanted to develop over 500 units, and the city balked at that. And so if they had done 501 units, that would have been the maximum incentive payment of, I think it was $600,000. They settled on a number of allowing 350 units, and that gave the next highest rung, which was $350,000.
Mm-hmm. But I understand the developer.
Ron, could I suggest that maybe we limit to one question per person? There's a lot of people with their hands up, and I hate to see the half hour with a back and forth between one person.
Yeah, Ms. Hill, we'll if we have time at the end, we'll come back to more questions from you.
Okay.
I'd like to move on.
I'd like to talk about the budget, the project budget at the end.
Thank you. I have Mr. Coughlin next on the.
Yes, hello.
Mr. Coughlin, yes.
Thank you guys for opening the questions. My questions regarding parking. And I'm curious, I think I saw 1.5 cars per residential unit. And is that based on any data collection, like the excise tax taken in Manchester, or is that a standard calculation? And if we're looking at, I think it was 200 units, roughly, we'll call it, or potentially, that's what, 300-400 cars per in this area alone, in addition?
Yeah. This 1.5 spaces per unit is sort of considered kind of a best practice of an area that doesn't have transit right on it, but does have sort of some element of walkability to it. I think many places currently require too much parking. They might require 2 spaces, 2.5 spaces per unit. That takes up a lot of pavement, and it costs a lot of money for a developer. So, we could certainly go even lower than 1.5 spaces. I think 1.5 is kind of a number that does have there are communities, a number of places that are willing to build at that. And developers, developers aren't going to build a project if it's not going to be successful. And so I've seen generally they're kind of aiming at 1.5 spaces per unit. I actually think you could go lower and it actually would be okay, because I think you're going to have a lot of people who are in 1 bedrooms with only have 1 car at all, or maybe I think frankly there's going to be a number of people who probably have no car. They would rely on Zipcar. They would take the bike down to the commuter rail station to get to work. So that's kind of where we get 1.5 spaces. It's just kind of like a considered best practice.
So I would suggest that you could easily take the excise tax number of residents and homes in Manchester and determine, is that a realistic number or not? And that was just my comment. So thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Caravallo.
Yes, good evening, and thank you for your work on this. 2 questions. One is, can the 40R project that's being proposed occur in the absence of the 40B project that's over at Shingle Hill? That's the first question. The second question has to do with the protected open space requirement of 20%. You have 20% of the total project area plus 20% of the usable open space in the defined development. Is that inclusive of site setbacks and whatnot? So for example, if you have a vernal pool and you've got a 100-foot setback from that vernal pool, is that something that's contemplated in that, or is that area already excluded based on your graph? Thank you.
All right, so I'll start with the open space. We could do it, it can be done anyway. At this point, we're at the highest level of the concept. And so that's one of the things I'm interested to hear what people's thoughts are as it relates to that. Sometimes what I've seen, for example, is it can be only maybe if you have 20% that is protected open space, only 50% of that can come from wetlands. So it has to go beyond that, since that's essentially protected anyway. So if there's a vernal pool, for example, that would fall under that. So we can define it however we want. And so that's one of the things we're looking for feedback. I don't know if I fully followed your question. The 40R district can be done exclusive of the 40B. Maybe you can clarify your question.
Sure. So there's a certain amount of housing, residential, associated with the 40R project, as I understand your presentation materials. And is your 40R project, or is the 40R project, does that contemplate that the 40B project will proceed and that will contribute a number of units that can be applied to the 40R? And so if the 40B, for example, were to go down in flames for environmental reasons, could the 40R assume some additional residential component to it that might or might not add to the 40B housing component?
Yeah. So yes, if there is if the 40R happens to be proposed and applied for to DHCD before the 40B actually gets, if it receives approval, the units from the 40B actually get to count towards that 40R number. So they would be able to count towards that.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any questions, other questions, or should we move on?
I have a Sarah Melish and then Foley, but Mary, didn't you ask questions yesterday?
This is Sarah. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes.
this is me. Oh,
Go ahead, Sarah.
Right. So it's my understanding that under the 40R, town receives certain financial concessions. Has there been any cost benefit analysis made regarding the financial concessions to the town versus the cost of additional services?
Sue, do you want to take that as relates to?
Sure. Sure. So there has not been a fiscal analysis of the permitting, because what we're working on right now is the permitting. So we don't even, other than these preliminary number of units, we're not sure. We haven't, first of all, we haven't landed on what our desired density is, or tolerance is for commercial, et cetera. But the fiscal analysis wouldn't really be done until there was an actual project coming forth. So while we're permitting it, we don't know what's going to get built. So there really isn't, I mean, there would really be very difficult to do a reliable fiscal analysis on this, on what we're permitting. I mean, it could be very, very high level, but I don't know how much that would, I don't know what that would give us.
But is there a substantial difference based on whether the 40B is approved prior to the 40R, and the 40R goes in with the requirement of 51% residential?
Oh, you're asking about the different, you're asking about an either or situation?
Timing.
Oh, timing wise, thank you for clarifying. Yeah, so timing wise, it would, so this is, and then we need to stay on top of this with DHCD, but timing wise, the 40R would need to be approved before the 40B is approved. So
if the 40B is approved before the 40R, then we still need 51% residential in the 40R.
I think it would still count as the number, but I don't think it would count towards our incentive. Would you say that would be true? Chris?
I think that would be true. You know, frankly, if the 40B goes in first, it might just behoove the town to change the boundaries and just not include the 40B, and we'd have to think about that, I guess, whether there really is any benefit.
But wouldn't we still need 51% in the 40R?
Yes.
Yes, you would.
Okay, Chris, could you move on? I see there's two questions I didn't get to, but we'll get to them. Two people with their hands up, but I've got them written down. We'll get to them at the next break. Thanks.
Okay, great. So I mentioned at the beginning, one of the things with the 40R that we can do is create design standards. So just to kind of clarify some sort of nomenclature here, often that sort of complements a zoning bylaw would be design guidelines. And the difference between guidelines and standards is that guidelines are just that, they're guidance. A developer doesn't actually have to follow them and can still develop, whereas these standards, they are obligatory. So they have to actually meet the standards. One of the things that we do that I think it's important to note with both zoning and with the design standards is this sets forth a framework. And so it's it doesn't dictate an actual sort of specific design or a use in one specific parcel, for example. What we're doing is trying to create that framework so that any development that does occur sort of meets kind of the vision of what the town has. So this kind of little bubble diagram on the top sort of explains kind of the general concept that we sort of have come up with for this area, that for any sort of project, a landowner has essentially two options in terms of how they are developing. They can develop a cluster that is a commercial mixed-use cluster, or they can develop a cluster that is what I'm calling a low-impact residential area cluster. And so the latter, that cluster could consist of a combination of cottages and townhomes. In either case, of course, we still have the required open space. And I think one of the other kind of critical things would be that within that open space and connecting to any of these clusters are various pedestrian connection points. The other thing that I think for everyone who's sort of listening in right now and maybe kind of half listening, I think this is an important time to sort of just tune in for a second, because I have a bunch of diagrams that I'm going to go through from here, and some of them are kind of closer to the ground, some of them are higher level. I think it's really important just to remember that these diagrams are just illustrative. These are not actual design proposals. They are not dictations of what a developer needs to build. They're used to help explain what could be built and kind of communicate both the general vision and principles and what the specific standards are. So I just want to kind of make that clear, because sometimes that causes some confusion in terms of these types of, when we kind of show these types of diagrams. So the way these design standards are organized, like I think I said, it's a separate document from the zoning bylaw itself, but they go hand in hand in a lot of ways. And so I've divided it into 4 sections. The first one is on the pedestrian experience. And when I talk about pedestrian experience, what I'm really talking about is what makes an area that people actually want to walk. What are those characteristics? The second one is the kind of the integration with nature and the sustainability aspect. The third one is connectivity. So it's a little bit different from pedestrian experience. Here, I'm actually talking about, is a place actually safe to walk and comfortable to walk or bike? And then finally, we have a section on the buildings themselves. And the way the standards are organized, they begin, each section begins with sort of some principles that are sort of kind of aspirational, and it helps convey to a landowner sort of what, you know, according to this bylaw, that the town sort of would like to see. And then there are specific standards that actually need to be adhered to in order to actually receive the permit. So I'll go through these quickly. I'm not obviously going to go through every single standard, but I'm just going to kind of hit some of the highlights and kind of help show sort of the way that the standards are organized. So each section, beginning with the pedestrian experience, begins with this one diagram that is sort of annotated with different elements. And this sort of diagram tries to bring everything together to kind of convey the kind of image of pedestrian experience. And then each of these, in this case, letters A through E, are then have additional standards that explain what we mean. So I'll just talk about a couple of them here. First being building placement and parking placement, I think are two, in my mind, of the absolute most critical things for the success of creating a walkable development or neighborhood. And so the design standards, there's text as well as additional sort of diagrams and photos to sort of help explain what the standard would mean. And in this case, with building orientation, what we're essentially talking about is orienting buildings so that they are oriented towards common open spaces. The character of those open spaces will be quite different if it's the commercial mixed use type of area versus a low impact residential area. And I think those images hopefully help convey that. And I think working closely with the built-in placement and orientation is the parking placement. So one of the questions, again, from the survey was really asking people about their priority between the location of parking and the overall pedestrian experience. And as you can see, really an overwhelming percentage of people who responded to the survey said that they care most about walkability, and they're okay with a slightly longer walk, as we defined it, less than 3 extra minutes if it helps improve that walkability. And I think that's really critical in my mind, because I think the location of parking has such a tremendous impact on whether a place feels sort of walkable. And I think it's a fairly easy thing to kind of quote unquote fix, but it's also something that seems to be not done, especially in sort of suburban developments. I think there's a sort of a very standard way and approach of parking and parking placement. So I think in my mind, this might be one of the most important aspects that I would sort of recommend including. And of course, there are going to be times where maybe parking isn't practicable to be behind a building, but in those cases, they can be sort of buffered appropriately through various landscaping interventions. The next kind of section deals again with kind of helping to preserve sort of the natural environment. And again, one of the questions was, what were the top 2 environmental goals? And the top 2 that came through actually work really hand in hand together. One was that what is called low impact design should be incorporated into developments that helps protect watersheds. And the second was that compact development should occur because that helps then allow more space to be preserved. And in fact, one of the techniques of low impact development is compact development. So I think, again, they work really nicely and can do help with the character of this district in terms of helping to preserve land while still allowing for development to occur. This, again, it's organized in the same way. A lot of the focus of these design standards in this section relate again to helping to protect watersheds through things such as bioretention areas and rain gardens, having permeable surfaces, minimizing the impervious surfaces that you have. So I think in this section, it would essentially be more of like a menu of options that a developer would have to incorporate into their site plan. And then connectivity. Again, we asked, once you get to this district, how would you like to get around? And again, you can see the overwhelming, over 90%, 95% want to either walk or bike to get around once they're here. Of course, many people will probably drive to get here, but the thought is that hopefully people would like to park once and then just be able to walk around. And so I think, to me, what it really speaks to is that there needs to be lots of connections. Not just on-road connections, but trails and paths to help connect people throughout the district to the various development clusters that may occur. What we care really about here is so much as pedestrian safety and comfort. And there's a little bit of a distinction in terms of the requirements between what would be required in sort of a commercial area that would be a little bit denser versus kind of a low impact area, residential area, or the areas in between. One of the things that really contributes to pedestrian safety is what the street width is. The narrower a street is, or a driveway is, the slower that cars and trucks will actually drive, and that improves safety. It also helps achieve the goal of minimizing the impervious surfaces. I think in a place like in the commercial mixed use areas, it's really important to have sidewalks on both sides of the street where practicable, whereas in a low impact residential area, having a sidewalk on one side is probably sufficient. Having crosswalks, of course, is important. But the type of crosswalk is also important because not all crosswalks are sort of equal. So requiring certain types of high visibility crosswalks will improve safety. And then another, I think, important piece is even for parcels that are separate parcels that might have development, there are opportunities to have connections between those parcels through pedestrian, again, paths, or whether it's sidewalks or what have you. And I think that also helps kind of create that connection because, you know, people want to walk in the most direct way possible. Here, this is just an example, again, showing how the design standards are incorporate kind of a combination of photos as well as the diagrams to help sort of convey to the potential developer sort of what the expectations would be for this area. The final section is buildings. So the buildings, the pictures here that you can see, this comes from the survey. These were the top choices from the survey, from the visual preference component of the survey. And so again, I think what you can see, some takeaways is people are looking for, you know, buildings that are sort of traditional design. Again, as I mentioned, the townhomes and the cottages kind of came through as the top kind of choices as well. But overall, I think there's an aesthetic that is sort of generally in keeping with the character of what you would expect for a smaller New England town. And so the standards for the buildings, you know, we're not sort of dictating a specific architectural style or a type of building. I think instead what we're recommending is to sort of set the framework that, you know, generally buildings should have the characteristics of traditional New England village types of characteristics to them. And we want to avoid monotony, which is another reason for not sort of specifying that all buildings are essentially the same style. One of the things that we do want to also mention is that while we probably wouldn't expect too large of buildings, I think we do want to have some standards that sort of limit the building size, but also where some buildings are a little bit larger, there are ways to sort of quote unquote break down the building so that visually it reads as a smaller building through various types of vertical and horizontal sort of modulation. And so we include those in the standards. And then finally, again, this kind of came through from the visual preference survey. People had a strong preference for sort of the traditional roof lines, so the pitched roofs. And so we, you know, explain the types of roofs that are allowed in the district. And we also are proposing to allow the planning board to grant other types of roof designs because there could be a good reason or a great design that really fits with something that again contributes to the overall enhances the neighborhood. Okay, so that I'll stop there and I guess I'll kick it back to you, Ron, to
Okay, Chris, thank you. Great presentation. I just want to get to some people who haven't asked questions. Ms. Furlong, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, thank you very much. Chris, I really appreciate the fact that you've taken us from a very good global view down to specifics. And I'm going to ask a question that might require some input from either Ms. Brown or Mr. Federspiel. But in your comments, both yesterday and today, you've mentioned the fact that there are 4 primary private landowners, those being Gordon College, the Brown family, and neither of those 2 are involved in this particular geographic area, plus Manchester by the Sea and the MAC. You've then gone on to say that as you look at the specifics, there's about 25 acres that could be developed. And I realize that I've omitted some comments about some small landowners that are in that area. But my question is, for those 25 acres, who are the landowners? Number 1. And number 2, is the second step of this process to have Manchester by the Sea sell some of its acreage to a developer in order to accomplish this 40R?
Okay, I'll start and then Sue, you can fill in. But I think the one clarification that I mentioned before, but I just want to kind of again say that it's not 25 acres. Again, that is 25 acres. That is sort of for the calculation purposes. The district is 112 acres. And I think it's safe to assume that, you know, more than 25 acres could be developed. And I know one of the owners is the owner of the MAC. And that's a substantial portion of the district, but I'll then allow Sue to fill in some of the other blanks there.
Sure. Thanks for your question. The owners in the district the district does include the Brown Family Trust, and we realize that is under agreement, but as it is currently laid out, it does still include that owner. It includes Mr. Brady, who owns the land abutting the MAC. It includes the parcel that has the medical building already on it, the farm stand, the doggy daycare parcel on the other side of the street, and the town-owned parcels. And I would say, unless Mr. Fetterfield wants to jump in, there isn't any intent at this time for there hasn't been any consideration yet at this time for the town to sell for development purposes. I think we have identified some municipal uses that might live within the district, however. Thank you.
Okay. So and I understand there's 112 acres, but the high priority 25 acres, it seems to be the most developable. How much of that is Manchester land, Manchester by the Sea, town-owned land?
So I'm going to try to clarify again. The actual acreage is 115. The only reason that we're talking about 25 acres is because the state has put forth a formula whereby they allow, or they mandate, or they lay out a way to identify area that is most likely developable. In this case, they take away anything with a slope of a certain intensity, and they take away wetlands, et cetera. We know wetlands can't be developed on, but almost the entirety of the area is sloped, and we know that that can be developed. So again, it's not 25 acres. It's really a considerable amount more than that, even if you take away
I understand.
the
I
wetlands.
understand that, but of the 25 acres that we're talking about, what specific portion is owned by the town of Manchester by the Sea?
Of the 115 acres, I think there's
No, of
about
the
6 or 7.
25.
I'm sorry, it just doesn't work that way. You're not understanding. Go, Greg, do you want to give it a shot?
Well, I was just going to suggest perhaps, Chris, if you could go back to your slide that has the 115 or so acres, and it shows the different parcels, and we can.
Maybe this one. This shows where again, the red is the slope. So I don't know which of these parcels Manchester owns, but technically the 25 acres is this kind of teal blue area. Again, this doesn't mean that this is where the development would occur. In fact, the owner of the MAC has already given some thought about developing parts that would all be where all the red is.
Well, in the red, yeah, the current MAC is in the red.
Exactly, yeah.
But
And
if you
all of the, go ahead.
If you
Go
look
ahead.
at this, yeah, I'm sorry. If you look at this particular diagram, so if you're on School Street, just to the east where the two town-owned parcels are, where the compost site is, yeah, exactly, right there. Those are the town-owned parcels, and those are, I want to say, in the 8-acre range, maybe in total.
Yes, there's 3 acres. There's 3 parcels there that are all.
Three parcels, maybe eight or so acres altogether.
Yeah.
You're showing them all red, all, not within that 25.
Okay, thank you. That clarifies it for me, Greg. Thank you very much.
And Sue was right when she commented about there are no plans currently to sell any of the town land up there.
Okay, I see who hasn't spoken yet, somebody named Rick. Is there a last name? and identify yourself.
Sorry, couldn't unmute there. Hi, Rick Rogers, 82 Old Essex Road. So I have a couple clarification questions. I'm sorry, and they should be quick, but had a trouble logging in at the beginning. So is it Mark Kushel? Mike? Chris, sorry. So if I remember from one of your slides, I think you're talking about 350 units or 250 units.
Yes, so we were, sorry, let me find the correct slide. It would total be 350 that could be allowed under this current proposal. Again, all these numbers can change based upon the input, but that's sort of what I would say would be the minimum cap that we could do.
Got it. So 350, right, at 3 people per unit, that's going to be 10 to 15% of the town's population. So that's not a significant, not an insignificant impact. My question on this, I guess, really comes down to this, if I'm understanding this right, this is all a proposed zoning bylaw change. Is there any like true incentive here other than the financial incentives? Is the town having to do this like 40B, or is this just kind of a nice to have?
Sure. Well, so first, in terms of your math there, I would kind of push back a little bit. I think you're unlikely to see 3 people per unit. I think this type of housing mainly attracts generally people who are, many people who are single or 2 people. It's not going to be a big generator of families, which would imply 3 people. So I think the number would be of residents would be quite a bit lower. I'd also note that, again, this is not something that would occur overnight. The way that you create a district, and it might take 20 years before something gets actually filled out to being built out. So that's the other thing. I think it's just sometimes that kind of gets lost. In terms of the purpose for doing this, I think this was kind of part of the introduction, which it sounded like you might have missed. And so maybe I'll allow Mr. Russell, if he's still on, to kind of summarize at a quick level, sort of what brought it to this planning process.
Appreciate it.
Sure, happy to review that quickly again. So it's not a matter of nice to have, and but it's a matter of a need that the town, the community has identified time and again in one form and another. But it's the top 2 recommendations that came out of the master planning process. First being to find a way to increase the town revenue so that we could support our infrastructure improvements and maintenance, which had fallen behind over the decades. And we need to take care of the infrastructure, but it's very difficult to pay for that with simply a residential tax base. And we all know what our taxes are. And the second measure that came out, or the second priority that came out of the master plan, was needing a diversity in housing types. And that's not just the subsidized affordable units that we're behind on, but we've been working on. But that's the reason why we have the 40B, because we haven't met our threshold of subsidized affordable housing requirements. But beyond that, it was very clear that the town identified different types of housing, again, besides large single family homes. And so this is where we've landed after several years of conversations about different strategies and different locations. And this area in the LCD, given that it's underutilized at the time, and but it's already disturbed, and it's in a location that is not trying to push large projects into established neighborhoods. This is where we've landed on a place to start this conversation about how we can get the revenue that we need. Of course, the town can always say no. Certainly this could all go down in flames and we won't do anything. We just keep as is. But then when we have costs that are increasing, then we have to fall back on the residential tax base to take care of that. So that's how we arrived at this point. It's really, I wouldn't say it's emergency, but it's certainly more of a need than a nice to have.
Fair enough. I guess my last comment would be that the survey results all look great, and I appreciate you're taking that into consideration. But I took that survey and I don't seem to recall kind of the question being, would you want it to be developed, or in which direction would you want it to be developed? It kind of started with, okay, we're going to develop this area. What do you want it to look like, right? So I kind of feel like we would need to step back to that first question.
Yeah, I think, I'm sorry, go ahead, Gary.
No, I'm sorry. That's understood. I think part of the issue is that the process has been a very long process. And so for some folks, there certainly is a disconnect. But as I mentioned, the recommendation for development came out of the master planning process and subsequent conversations with town departments, stakeholders, and the planning board. So this is the conversation we are having is assuming we want to have development and we wanted to look at this place, what might it look like? It doesn't mean this is the only option, and it doesn't mean that it has to happen. It's just a starting point for where we're at now to try to address these two problems that were identified.
And so I guess, I'm sorry, one last question is that this will come up before town meeting or something else to like, this isn't just going to be a committee to decide.
Right. So quickly on that, it will go through more public process. We don't have a schedule of how many more forums like this we may have, but the idea is that we're going to take this feedback. Chris will incorporate that into another draft. There will be more discussions amongst planning board members themselves in our meetings and public comment. And then eventually, if we all get to a place that we think it's a good place to head, there will be a public hearing where the public puts input for the planning board to make the decision of whether to put it forward at a town meeting. And if it gets on the warrant, then town meeting will vote. Now, I do want to make a correction. In my introduction, I said because it does have to go to town meeting, it's a 2/3 vote. But someone else maybe can back me up on the specifics. But I was reminded that the governor did issue an order that because of COVID and the economic situation, that the vote is actually a majority, not a 2/3 vote. But I don't know what the timelines are for that. So someone else will have to help me.
Yeah, I would know it isn't to do with COVID. It was a legislature that was passed as part of House Bill 2520 or 5250. And it was a zoning reform that 40R districts and other zoning that allows an increase in density of housing only need to pass by a simple majority at town meeting, but still affirmative town meeting vote is required.
Okay. Thank you, Sue. And I apologize for my confusion on that, but I hope that helps for everyone. Thanks, Sue.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I
Ron,
see.
I'd like to get on the list, Ron. Ron, I'd like to get on the list. I'm calling in. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Lorraine,
I can hear you.
Ronnie, may I get on the list? I'm calling in. Thank you.
Yes, okay. I see Miss Foley on the, hasn't spoken yet.
Oh.
Hi, thanks, Ron. Chris, a quick question. I'm just trying to understand the numbers with the housing, with the 255 multifamily and the 95 cottages used as an example. You said that with the cap on the residential, and that would be the lowest. My question is, what would be the highest? And does Manchester determine that cap? And could a developer come in then though and say they need more density to meet profit numbers, and then DHCD would allow that?
Okay, so the highest would essentially be to be unfettered. And so you could assume 20 units per acre, and it could potentially be, not 200, probably wouldn't be 20 times 112 acres, because some of that land truly is environmentally constrained, but it could be something in that neighborhood. If it was truly uncapped, I think that's unlikely, but that could be the potential for what you could get if you had no cap at all.
So who places the cap?
So the cap would be written into the zoning bylaw itself. So this is completely the town's decision and the town's power in terms of how that is enforced. If a developer came and said, we can't make that, it's written to the zoning bylaw, I think you would have to amend your zoning bylaw, or they would have to go for a variance, if you even allow that type of variance, which it looks like Sue's might be shaking her head. So it's essentially set in stone, I feel like. Sue, if you wanted to add anything, feel free.
No, I would just say that the cap is what you've said. It's the town's power to, and I'm sure would want to have a cap. What it can't do is go below the required density, which is why that 25 acres is important. That's the number that the state uses to say, well, your minimum density has to be 20, 25.3 acres. That's how you get that density. So we can't go below, we can't say a less density, but we can cap the density at that minimum amount. Hope that helps.
Okay, the next person who called in, Ms. Iavoni, you haven't spoken yet, so you're on.
Okay, thank you, Ron. Lorraine Iavani, 20 Pine Street. The question I have, first of all, I want to thank Chris. Well done, MACP, that you have put a lot of work. I've sat in, this is the second night, so I did want to understand what we're talking about. The question I have is, has the town asked you to do a proposal, or within your scope, to do to design what I would call a level 3 assisted living facility, whereby some of the units would, count as affordable units, and then the congregate units for, when people need to have care, those would be more commercial. It just seems to me, and I'll go back to Mr. Russell for a moment, that on the master plan, I filled in the survey, a lot of people did, and there's certainly a need there because we're a town of many seniors. I think it might be around 40%. I don't have an exact figure, but without a doubt, what I'm not hearing here is, and I know this is an option, the new neighborhood, but what I'm not hearing is, taking care of our seniors. I know that's a theme that I come up with a lot, but quite frankly, I'm very serious about it. And what I want to know, Chris, is has the town asked the state to come up with some kind of design plan for, like Brooksby Village, everyone knows that. In Danvers, that's an example. Beverly has a couple on Conant Street near the airport. We need in this town assisted living. Some of it will be counted against affordable housing and some of it commercial. And, I don't know if the owner, I don't know if the owner of, may I finish? I don't know if the owner of the MAC has any plans for something like this, but it seems to me that would be a perfect solution to what we want to do back there. Now, that's all I want to add, basically, because quite frankly, what I'm hearing tonight, and I know, Chris, you want to take some of these comments back, I'm really concerned about, anywhere from 255 units to maybe even 350, I don't know. And then we factor in the unknown, which is the 40B, and then we can't control the timing. I know that we can control whether we want this project or
Ron,
not.
maybe an end to the question would be helpful. There's other people that will want to discuss.
Well,
what's the question?
I think, excuse me, Okay, this is where, you know, you're having a workshop. So far, we've heard a briefing. I heard it yesterday. I'm hearing it today. What I'm trying to do is just give you a few comments. I'm going to get off the phone in a moment. But what I would like the state to do, and I'm going to say the state, is I'd like to see some kind of plan for assisted living, a level 3 like Brooksby, not this new neighborhood that, quite frankly, again, I'm really concerned about the impact here with a number of units, and it will change and it will impact the town significantly if we were to do the 40B and then this. It doesn't make, quite frankly, to me, it doesn't make any sense. So that's what I want to say. I appreciate the time, and I want to thank Chris. It's a lot of hard work, and I do appreciate it. But if you can come up with the town and get a plan together and present that as another option, then, you know, I have a feeling that would be well received. And that's what I want to say, Ron. Those are my comments, and thank you very much. Thank you. I'll get off now. Thank you.
Thank you for the comments. You know, I think our role on this project is specifically for 40R. It would be a separate project, and it sounds like a very interesting project to focus only on sort of assisted living. But I think one of the things I would note is assisted living is one of the uses that we are considering to allow as part of this. And in fact, we know that there is some interest potentially in developing it. And those units would be able to count as part of the 40R for some, depending on the level of care that's occurring in those units.
Okay, so I see we have several people who have asked questions already, still with their hands up. So
Ron, may I make just a point of order about that? I'm not sure that in terms of Zoom protocol, everyone knows that they have to lower their hand. Or do you have a second set of questions, people? You need to, where you clicked raise your hand, if you don't have a question, you need to lower your hand.
Well, thank you, Sheila. That's a good point. So I've seen some hands are going down. This may be good news.
I know mine is still up, but I don't know about the other.
Yes, if you're getting tired, let me know if your hand's getting tired.
No.
So
Unlikely.
okay,
Ron,
we
Ron,
can just.
I see a Mr. Bill Cross, so I think he's physically raising his hand. I think he would like to speak. I've seen it a few times.
I don't see his. Okay.
I can't figure out how to.
Oh, you click on your name and it'll. Go ahead, Bill.
I can't do it. I keep clicking on it, and all I get is no response. All I got is my God-given hand.
Well, with all this technology you use for your lectures, you should be able to know this stuff.
I know.
Well, go ahead.
I've got just two questions, simple questions. One is, what is the experience that you've had around the state or around the MAPC with high density 40Rs, which like this one are segregated from the rest of the town? They're islands away from public transit and the rest of the fabric of the town. Can you just talk through what those good comparable places are?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think the point of your question is how do we integrate these developments with the rest of the town? I think is probably the heart of what you're.
No, I'm really asking, where else have we seen high density development in an island like this? Because we'll learn from other towns' experiences.
Mm-hmm.
What are those other towns?
Yeah, I mean, so off the top of my head, the projects that I've been experienced in are sort of generally more on top of transit. So Manchester is a little bit different in the sense that I think it maybe stretches the definition a little bit of a smart growth location. But that being said, I think it's fairly close. So I guess I don't have a good answer in terms of what is the experience. Sue, I think you want to jump in?
Sure, I can offer an example for Mr. Cross. Mr. Cross, take a look at River Bridge. It's a development in the tiny rural town of Berlin, Mass. And they went through a process very much like a 40R overlay, but it wasn't through the state program. They created their own overlay district and identified exactly the type of uses and housing that they wanted, created the zoning around it. It is not next to its downtown. It is off the highway interchange. And after 11 years is getting nicely built out. They created their own on-site septic system, very much like this one may need to do. So there are definitely great examples of how to create a vital and vibrant and distinct, but integrated community neighborhood that's not part of the historic fabric. So I have every confidence that it can be done if we put our good work, our minds together and do the good work that's needed.
So Berlin, Mass. And are there
Yeah.
things that we can look at besides Berlin?
That's the one that I'm most familiar with. I'm happy to find some others and maybe post them on the website if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I think it would be helpful. It'd also be very helpful, which is my second question, to know what the fiscal and other impacts have been. We gather that residential developments generally lose money for towns, and certainly the 40B would lose money. And that the other night, it would be helpful to understand what other towns' experience has been in terms of the financial drag on the town, since the logic for the 40R was that it would be a financial benefit to the town. So.
Yeah, so I spoke with the good folks at Berlin today, actually, so they would be a good model to look at, and it certainly has not been it has been certainly revenue positive for that tiny town, and it has a large housing component. Also has a hotel. So.
If you can give some specifics about what their experience has been, I think that would be great for the town to see the specific dollars and cents for them, as well as the other impacts. Perhaps there have been ways that 40R has brought in more economic developments, more varied commercial activities. It'd be great to know about that.
Yeah. So to be clear, it wasn't a 40R, but it was an overlay district similar to what we're proposing here. Just went through a different process. But
okay, great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Okay, time's getting short. We have 3 questions. All these ladies, the 3 S's, we'll start with Sarah Melish, then go to Sandy, then go to Sheila, and then we'll close. So Sarah, go ahead if you have a question.
I do not have a question. I don't know why my hand is still raised.
All right, Sarah, put your hand down. You've got other boards to take care of. Sandy?
Yeah, can you pull up the parcel analysis slide? Okay, so my question here, I'm trying to understand this, is that we've got a proposed district that's in blue. We've got slope constrained, which is red, and we've got Manchester parcels that are proposed. So it would be good to have a better understanding of who owns what property. But one of the things I'm a little confused about is that if we are still unsure about the land across the street, the brown shingle Place Hill property as being proper from an environmentally sensitive point of view, and you've got this blue area that's even closer next to the cedar swamp, and some other areas across the street that looks to be close to some of the wetlands there, is why would we include in the acreage this land here? Like, why would Manchester want to open up a 40R district that would allow this kind of building to happen when we're not even sure if areas that are a little bit further away from the wetlands to be proper? So I guess this is beyond just the consulting group. This is for the whole town. I guess, and it looks like some of the drawings are based on land across the street, a little bit closer to the MAC and such. So having a better understanding of that, but I just don't understand why we wouldn't want to preserve that land and call that off boundary for this kind of development.
I can maybe, I think at least help to answer your question. So in terms of the boundaries, which the boundaries of the district is kind of where I think you can hopefully see the hand on my cursor. On this side, where I think is where it's more environmentally constrained, the reason that where the blue line is where it is because it follows the parcel line. And often the parcels are either adjacent or even include sensitive areas. If it is a wetlands won't be developed. But one of the other comments that came up last night that I thought was a really great, potential thing that we should probably be including is that we can include actually a buffer. So even if it's within the district, we can require a buffer that says from wetlands, you cannot develop within, and we can pick a number, 150 feet or something along those lines. And I think that will go a long way into helping to preserve the areas that we really want to make sure we preserve and keep pristine.
So if we could develop a 40, so say 40B doesn't go through and 40R does go through, we could actually state that particular areas cannot be built on, and even more than just a buffer zone from wetland, that we could actually take portions of this district and say, this is what can be developed and this is what can't? Or do we define it as this is the buildable 40R within a certain boundary? Like, are there certain stipulations?
I think the latter is really the right approach. We set up what are the stipulations that where you can't build and why, and we include those.
Okay.
So, so Chris, I would say, Sandy, that this process is identifying the actual boundary as well. 40R districts can be a single parcel, anything from a half an acre to 150 acres or infinitely big, but there's no size, and this is part of our consideration is what lands would we potentially want developed. If the 40B were not in existence, we may not be thinking of including the land to the west of School Street. We may. It may be something that people would want to see some development up there. But that's all part of the consideration. So it doesn't have to include these parcels, but I would say most of the parcels to the east of School Street, while they may be close to environmentally sensitive areas and we want to be considerate of the environment throughout all of this area and throughout all of Manchester, much of the MAC land, the town-owned land, has been, is already disturbed.
Right, but I see this big blue swatch that's over right against where that brown property is, up against where you walk into the MECT area, and that's part of this district, which to me just doesn't make sense that you would do additional development there. So
yeah, and I'm quite certain we wouldn't. That's land that's part of the Brown Family Trust parcel. And while it may not have a lot of hills there, it may not have a lot of slope there, there would be other reasons why you wouldn't want
right,
to.
I'm seeing
why you
light
wouldn't want to
blue.
develop there.
I'm seeing
Yeah,
light blue, which says Manchester parcels. So
yeah, but it doesn't mean that that's where we would want to or expect the area to be developed.
right. So I would think that we'd want to redraw boundaries minimally to ensure of that. So thank you.
Ron, do you mind if I just add just quickly to this? For folks on the presentation, I'm going to suggest that if you want to look at the boundaries, that you look, I think it was the opening slide. This slide, I might suggest, Chris, if it's okay, before we repost it in the next version, maybe the parcel analysis slide needs to have sort of a big disclaimer that that graphic really is just about the way the state calculates their formula for incentive payments and caps and requirements and so forth. It really has no realistic relationship to what we want to do with the boundaries of the district. Unfortunately, it catches your eye because it's, it's red and blue and it seems, pretty certain. But I also just want to reinforce what Sue said, that based on all the work that we've done with the community and committees and the planning board through the master plan process and beyond, I don't think that we would be looking at that land adjacent to the Cedar Swamp if it weren't for the fact that the 40B is being proposed. So that is an ongoing issue that we'll have to look at as this process moves forward. Because if the 40B happens, without our control, then perhaps we can take advantage of that, which in terms of the count for the housing. But if the 40B disappears, if there's something that happens either in a change of ownership or a restriction that project goes away, then I think certainly we want to rethink where that boundary is, and we can do that.
Right. And I just want to add the graphic that I was looking at is not the one that's up on the screen. It says parcel analysis, where there's environmentally like sort of an Excel spreadsheet, and it says parcels 15, district size 112. There's a big blue swath on that other side there that says it's Manchester parcels proposed. So
Yeah,
that's,
I understand it's confusing. It's not accurate. I think, again, it's difficult to explain, but this is really sort of a bureaucratic map that the state is using to simply come up with the formula. We certainly are not proposing development right next to the Cedar Swamp.
The map is just showing, the blue is just showing where it's not proposed development, it's where the proposed district is. It actually is, it's this. But anyway, Gary, I think that was a great point about putting a big disclaimer on that map, and I will do so.
yeah, again, I'm looking at this other one.
Yes,
that says analysis. And that one's even more confusing regarding the proposed Manchester parcels, which is even more offensive regarding the abutting to Old School Street. Thank you.
Understood.
Okay, we'll finish up with Sheila. Time is getting on here.
You're on mute.
I am?
No,
No, I am. Ron, in your honor, I will give up my questions regarding what this MAPC budget, the MAC project is costing the town. I will give that up in favor of just asking Chris. Actually, it's a comment on this evening's meeting overall. I'm puzzled. This project was marketed to the town as support for developing commercial tax revenue. We have spent the entire evening talking about residential clusters, residential acreage, 350 homes, potential density. It's my understanding that by right, I think the process is you're suggesting we make zoning changes, then a developer comes through the door, buys property. My understanding is by right, that developer can create an entirely residential area. But even if that isn't true, we haven't had any discussion on generating commercial tax revenue for the town. And that's what makes this project proposal, to me, highly irrelevant. Why don't we just, as a town, reach out to the people, the developers who have already indicated interest, and it goes even beyond the MAC people, and say, work with them around how much they would want to build, and how much revenue, we had to understand how much revenue that nets for us after the services are brought to them, which is going to cost us money as well.
Sheila, do you have a question?
No, I don't have a question. I have a comment, and I'm allowed to make a comment. So I just want to say that we're not meeting, Chris. It's not an indictment of you or the MAPC, because I know that this is the constriction of the project, but we haven't heard you talk about how to generate commercial tax revenue, and there's been no presentations or slides that have indicated any low manufacturing buildings or streetscapes that are include a biotech facility or whatever. So I just want to say that I think we've it's sort of like, where's the beef? We haven't really met the criteria that this project was meant to meet for the town so far in the discussion tonight.
Chris, I'm happy to take a swipe at that. So Chris, Sheila, I think you're right. The conversation has centered on residential. I think only because residential is high on people's minds, given the 40B and the question of whether we want to create more residential here. But in fact, 49% of the square footage would be commercial. And as you suggested, wouldn't it be great if we've talked with the landowners, which has been an ongoing discussion for a number of years, and which supported us in coming to the decision to study the 40R. So I am highly confident that what the landowners want to be built and what the first things that would come in the door would be the residential. And to Lorraine, the unassisted living facility is in that mix. So I think all of the uses that are shown are uses that people have indicated an interest in and a support for, right from the master plan, right through conversations with the landowners, through conversations with the public. So all of that, all of what you've suggested is what we're considering. And it didn't rise to the top in this discussion, but it is very much the reason for creating a 40R, although also our housing mix is in need of enhancement too. So I think people's just interest in residential and the fear that it may not produce revenue maybe elevated it. So to make this sound like it was a residential project only, but in fact, that's really not the case. And there are a fair amount of design guidelines having to do with commercial buildings and how to create a community around those. So.
Yeah. I think that's right on. Yeah, and apologies for not including more on the commercial side of things. I think it was maybe implied but not explicit, but that's actually part of the reason for limiting the number of residential units, is to ensure that there will be adequate space for commercial. Actually, your other question was what I would have loved to answer in terms of the budget, because I don't think this is costing the town, from what I recall, any money, because it's all coming from MAPC or otherwise state grants, or at least the vast majority of it is.
The majority.
Majority, okay. You did contribute some, sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you both. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Ron.
Okay, thank you all for attending. And thanks, Chris, and thanks, Sue. And I'd like to hear a motion for the planning board to adjourn.
I'll move, we adjourn.
I'll
Wait a second. Okay, roll call. Mr. Coons.
Yes.
Ms. Foley.
Yes, but I wasn't at the opening roll call.
That's right. You snuck in. Mr. Gilbert.
Thank you to everybody, and yes.
Mr. Russell.
Yes, and I'll just remind folks who haven't looked at the website to keep looking at that as we update information.
Okay, and we're adjourned. Thank you all, and keep looking.